Sacred Heart Hospital in Denver smells like antiseptic and slow dying. The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that sounds like regret, especially at 3 in the morning when the night shift moves through the ICU like ghosts on a schedule. Sarah Chen arrives 34 minutes before her shift starts. She doesn't check the clock. Her body knows time the way a compass knows north. 12 years of pre-dawn wake-up calls teach you that. Dr. Marcus Sterling watches her from the corridor's shadow, arms crossed, a coffee cup balanced against his chest like a trophy. He's been watching for 3 days. Not watching the way a supervisor watches. Watching the way a predator sizes prey, assessing for weakness, calculating which soft points yield first. He sees a quiet Asian nurse, late 20s maybe, hair pulled tight enough to erase her face, scrubs that hang like she's borrowed someone else's body. She keeps her eyes down when he enters a room. She never speaks unless spoken to. She never complains. She's invisible. Which is exactly why he can't stop staring at her. What Sterling doesn't see is the limp in her left leg on cold mornings like this one. Nothing dramatic. A half-inch shorter on the left, favoring the right. The kind of adjustment most people make unconsciously after spending 17 months with IED shrapnel embedded in their femur. What he doesn't see is the way her hands move when she inserts and precision like a surgical laser, muscle memory from a different lifetime, the kind of steadiness that comes from having threaded needles while explosions shook the ground beneath your boots. What he doesn't see is how her eyes scan every room she enters. The exits. The windows. The fire escapes. The second way out. Always the second way out. Sterling's power comes from the kind of ignorance that feels like intelligence. He's been at Sacred Heart for 8 years. He's accumulated allies the way other people accumulate experience. The hospital president plays golf with him every third Thursday. The cardiology department head borrowed money from him once, $20,000, never mentioned again. The imaging company that handles his kickback scheme, Apex Imaging, has already paid for his Range Rover and financed a lake house north of Boulder that he tells people he inherited. He moved $300,000 through hospital billing in the last 4 months alone. $4,000 weekly, minimum. And Sarah Chen walked into exam 4 on his worst day, saw him entering fake CT requisitions into the system while a sedated patient slept on the table, and something in her face registered. Not shock. Not moral judgment. Just recognition. The look of someone who understands exactly what she's watching, calculates the danger immediately, and chooses silence. That look terrifies him. The night shift begins at 3 o'clock. Sarah changes in the locker room, a space that smells like damp cotton and the residual perfume of day shift nurses who still believe in themselves. Her locker is third from the corner. She opens it with a motion so practiced it's nearly invisible. Inside, a dying succulent in a ceramic pot, the soil gray and cracked. A cracked mug that reads "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. And beneath a folded hospital towel, wrapped in silence, a pair of worn combat boots. Size 7. Tan leather, the kind that starts out bureaucratic and becomes personal. The laces are frayed. The heels are worn through on the outer edges, the result of 1,000 forced marches, 1,000 quick movements that favor escape over comfort. The sand embedded in the treads isn't from Colorado. Sand doesn't look that color here. That color comes from Tikrit. That color comes from places where IEDs hide in the street like sleeping animals, and they taught you that the difference between going home and not going home measured exactly 6 inches in any direction. She touches the boots once. Her fingers rest on the leather for 2 seconds. Then she closes the locker and the moment passes like it never happened. Room 407 sits at the end of the eastern corridor, the ICU's quietest corner, where the monitors beep in a rhythm that matches the hospital's baseline depression. Marcus Webb lies in the bed like something the river gave up. He's been comatose for 42 days. Army Ranger, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, call sign Wraith, which is what the men called him because he moved through rooms without announcing himself. 24 years old and built like a weapon. Then came the IED outside Sanjan Valley in Helmand Province, and the trauma wiped his history clean. His brain remembers how to breathe. Remembers how to process oxygen and turn it into heartbeat. The rest is gone. The doctors call it traumatic brain injury. They call it a miracle he survived. They don't call it the particular cruelty of being alive without knowing who you are. Sarah checks his vitals. The monitors show what they always show: blood pressure stable, oxygen saturation holding at 94%, heart rate steady in the low 80s, the kind of mechanical precision that proves a body can survive without a mind to give it instructions. She adjusts his blanket. The ventilator hisses its rhythmic breath, mechanical and patient, doing the work his lungs won't do alone. Her eyes catch his forearm. The tattoo stops her. Chen in block letters. Military print. The kind of tattoo someone gets when they're young and they know someone they trust enough to mark their skin with a name. Her hand hovers over it. Her fingers tremor, just for a moment, and then the control returns. The professional mask slides back into place like a door closing. She pulls her hand away. She never touches the tattoo again. Not tonight. Not any night. Sterling finds her in the break room at 4:15. The break room is where the night shift goes to pretend they're human. Sarah sits with a cup of tea that's gone cold, staring at nothing, which is exactly what it looks like when you're staring at everything simultaneously. Sterling leans against the door frame. He's still wearing his pressed shirt, still wearing his expensive watch, still wearing the confidence of a man who's never been told no by anyone with institutional power. His smile doesn't reach his eyes. It never does. Miss Chen. My office. Tomorrow. 0900. It's not a question. She nods once. She doesn't ask why. People who've learned discretion don't ask questions they already know they shouldn't have answers to. Sterling watches her for a moment longer, waiting for something, a reaction, a sign of fear, any indication that she understands the weight of what he's communicating. She doesn't provide one. She simply picks up her cold tea and returns to the unit, and that absence of fear registers in Sterling's chest like a small wound. The rest of the night shift moves through its choreography. Sarah moves through the rest of the night shift the way she moves through everything, efficiently, quietly, with the kind of presence that fills a room by not demanding attention. At 6 in the morning, when the day shift arrives and the fluorescent lights seem to brighten with the suggestion of normal people doing normal work, she leaves. She walks out through the parking lot where Denver's December rain hammers the asphalt like applause nobody asked for. The rain doesn't touch her. Or maybe it does, but she moves through it with such absolute certainty that it doesn't seem to matter. Her car is a 12-year-old Honda Civic, the kind of transportation someone chooses when they're planning to be invisible. She sits in the driver's seat for 3 minutes before starting the engine. Her hands rest on the steering wheel. They are steady. They're always steady. Hands that have held a tourniquet tight around a man's femur while rounds impacted concrete 6 inches away. Hands that have performed needle decompression at a second intercostal space while lying in a ditch. Hands that have held lives together through sheer force of will and muscle memory. Those hands don't shake. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that somewhere in this hospital, a man with her name tattooed on his forearm didn't remember her face. Didn't remember the day she'd carried him through fire. Didn't remember the choice she made, the moment she decided his life was worth more than her safety, more than her career, more than her future. The tattoo meant he'd once known her. The coma meant he knew her no longer. And Sarah Chen, Senior Chief Petty Officer, voluntarily discharged and deliberately anonymous, had chosen a hospital where the one person who remembered her enough to mark his skin couldn't remember her at all. She drove home through the rain. She didn't know that tomorrow's 9 o'clock meeting would change everything. She didn't know that the man in room 407 would soon have a visitor who would ask a single question, a question that would unravel the careful anonymity she'd built. She didn't know that sometimes the worst choice and the best choice are identical acts observed from different angles. For now, she drove. For now, she was still just a nurse. Still just the quiet woman who arrived early and left late and asked nothing of the world except to be left alone. Still just a nurse. The next morning, Sarah arrived before sunrise like she always did, her combat boots silent on the tile, and the first thing she noticed was Sterling's voice carrying from the nurse's station, thick with confidence, the kind of tone men use when they've already decided you're ending. He stood among four colleagues: Dr. Reeves from cardiology, nurse manager Patricia who'd hired her 3 months ago, and 2 residents Sarah recognized from the ER rotation. They clustered around the assignment board like spectators gathering for something inevitable. "Gentlemen, ladies," Sterling said, loud enough for the entire unit to hear, "I'm making a prediction." He gestured toward the corridor where Sarah was clocking in, not bothering to look at her. "Our little night owl here won't last the week. Any takers?" Nervous laughter. The kind that made the fluorescent light seem to hum louder overhead. Patricia shifted her weight, uncomfortable, her mouth tightening at the corners. One of the residents actually laughed, a short, barking sound like someone testing whether the water was cold before diving. "She's got that look," Sterling continued, his voice dropping into something almost sympathetic, almost cruel. "Deer in headlights. I don't belong here. You can always spot them. The ones who wandered into scrubs by accident." He turned slightly, just enough to catch Sarah in his peripheral vision. "What do you say, Chen? Think you can hack it here?" Sarah had stopped in the doorway. She could feel the moment crystallizing around her, the kind of moment that either breaks you or teaches you something about your own spine. She took one measured breath through her nose, the kind of breathing they'd taught her at Tikrit when IED shrapnel was still raining and your hands had to stay steady enough to apply a tourniquet. One breath. One decision to remain. "I'll do my best, Doctor," she said quietly. The words came out perfectly level. No tremor. No edge. Just a statement of fact, like reporting vitals. "Good girl," Sterling said, turning away. He turned his back to her like she'd already been dismissed from existence, and that's when the tear came, just one, a single drop that escaped before she could stop it. She felt it running down her cheek and wiped it without breaking eye contact with the nurse's station wall, with Patricia's uncomfortable posture, with the residue of their laughter still hanging in the air like smoke. The tear wasn't fear. It was something closer to recognition, the acknowledgement that this was just the beginning, that Sterling had decided her weakness and now he was going to spend his time proving it. 2 days later, the cafeteria at lunch rush. Sarah carried her tray past Sterling's table, tomato soup, a sandwich, coffee that had gone tepid in her locker because she'd been with Marcus in room 407, checking his monitors, understanding with a medic's precision that something was shifting in his neurological status, that the tattoo bearing her name on his forearm meant someone still knew her, even if his broken mind had forgotten. As she passed Sterling's table, he shifted his chair back with the kind of casualness that masks intention. His elbow caught her tray at exactly the right angle. The crash was audible. Soup exploded across the white styrofoam, splashing her scrubs, her hands, the floor. The cafeteria went dead silent, that particular silence where everyone has witnessed something and now everyone has to decide whether to pretend they didn't. Sterling's table erupted. 5 doctors laughing. The kind of laughter that tastes like permission, like safety in numbers, like a man who'd already confirmed his authority and could now afford to be generous with his cruelty. "Careful there, Butterfingers," Sterling said, his voice warm, almost concerned. "Maybe nursing's not your calling." Sarah knelt. One measured breath. She picked up each piece of tray, each dripping piece of bread, each scattered napkin. Her hands didn't shake. That was the thing they never understood, that survival wasn't about steady hands so much as it was about steady everything, about making your entire body into stone while your mind continued its work. A younger nurse from the day shift started toward her, movement toward help, toward normal human decency, and Sterling waved her off with a gesture so dismissive it might as well have been a command. "Let her clean up her own mess," he said. Sarah stood, her wet scrubs clinging to her ribs, and carried the tray to the trash. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The point had been made, not to her, but about her, in front of witnesses, establishing the narrative that would follow her around this hospital like a shadow. Sarah Chen couldn't handle this. Sarah Chen didn't belong. Sarah Chen was the kind of person you could knock down without consequence. Friday afternoon came cold and sharp. The cardiac unit, 3:38 p.m., Sarah at the nurse's station charting Marcus's latest vitals when Sterling approached with a patient file held like evidence. 6 staff members within earshot, she could feel them noticing, turning their heads with that particular anticipatory attention that meant something public was about to happen. He dropped the chart at her feet. The paper scattered across the tile floor like casualties, spreading in a geometric pattern of humiliation. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice carrying the kind of gentleness that made it worse, somehow, like he was helping her understand something about herself. "Page 7's incomplete. Night shift errors. Classic." Sarah looked at the chart. Then she looked at him. One measured breath, deep enough to anchor herself, the kind of breath that had gotten her through Tikrit and everything after it. Her eyes met his and didn't flinch. Her voice, when it came, was so quiet that people had to lean forward to hear it, and that quietness made it carry further than if she'd shouted. "I've been called worse by better men, Doctor." The words hung in the air between them like something physical. She could see his face darkening, the red climbing up his neck, the moment where his confidence met something unexpected and didn't know what to do with it. Behind him, Patricia turned away. One of the residents actually looked away, that particular shame of witnessing someone discover they were on the wrong side of a line. "You've got attitude, Chen," Sterling said, his voice tighter now, the sweetness gone. "That's a problem." He walked away. Sarah knelt to collect the papers. Her hands didn't shake. The tear came again, just one, wiped without breaking rhythm, without breaking composure, and she gathered each scattered page methodically, completely alone at the nurse's station, while the cardiac unit's monitors beat their steady rhythms around her and the fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum, and every person who'd witnessed this moment now knew something true about what Sterling wanted them to know, that Sarah Chen was someone you could push, someone you could corner, someone who would accept it quietly. What they didn't know, what no one in that hospital could have possibly known, was that she was counting. Counting every moment, every humiliation, every public reminder that she'd chosen this path of invisibility. She was counting like a soldier counts ammunition, like a medic counts the wounded, like someone with nothing left to lose counts the reasons to fight. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't even close to the worst part. Because Sterling wasn't finished. He'd only just begun. Monday morning arrived like a surgical blade, clean, precise, and designed to cut. The snow had stopped falling sometime after midnight, leaving Denver buried under 12 inches of white that muffled the city into silence. Sarah Chen sat in the Human Resources office on the 3rd floor of Sacred Heart, hands folded in her lap, waiting for the investigator to arrive. The chair was too soft. Everything about HR was too soft, soft carpet, soft lighting, soft color schemes meant to make difficult conversations feel less like executions. Sarah preferred hard surfaces. Tile floors. Metal chairs. Things that didn't pretend to be something they weren't. The door opened. A woman in her 60s entered, grey suit perfectly pressed, tablet in hand, the kind of professional whose entire career had been spent building files on people like Sarah. Judith Hammond. External investigator for Denver Health Systems. The nameplate on the desk outside had said so. Senior Chief Petty Officer Chen. Hammond's voice was polite. Neutral. The voice of someone who had already made up her mind based on paperwork alone. Just Sarah is fine. I'm here conducting a routine review of night shift protocols following some concerns raised about your clinical judgment. Hammond sat down, opening her tablet. We're looking at incident reports from the past 3 months. Several have your name on them. Sarah knew what was coming. Sterling had been busy. She could read it in the clinical distance in Hammond's tone, the kind of distance that meant her file had been thoroughly worked by someone with institutional connections. Someone who knew how to weaponize bureaucracy like a surgeon uses a scalpel. Can you walk me through the evening of November 18th? Sarah did. Calmly. Factually. The patient was a sepsis case, admitted at 2,200 hours, vital stable until 0300 when fever spiked to 103.4. She'd started the antibiotic protocol before the on-call physician even cleared it, 30 minutes of standard care based on clinical indicators, not protocol deviation. Hammond wrote something down. Didn't look up. The attending physician filed a complaint about that. Said you overstepped your scope. The attending was asleep when the fever spiked. I woke him. After administering medication he hadn't ordered yet. Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to feel it, not enough for anyone watching to see it. The patient's lactate was climbing. He needed antibiotics within the first hour. That's not overstepping. That's standard sepsis protocol. Hammond made another note. What about the patient in room for 12? October 9th. I don't recall a specific complaint. The chart shows you questioned the attending's pain management decision. In front of the patient's family. Sarah had been there when the patient, an elderly woman with metastatic cancer, had been prescribed a dose that was objectively inadequate. She'd mentioned it to the attending. Quietly. Not in front of anyone. The attending had told her she was being unprofessional for suggesting an adjustment to his prescription. She'd let it drop. The patient had spent the night in visible distress. I made a clinical observation. Dr. Sterling says you developed a pattern of insubordination. That you question attending physicians' orders regularly. There it was. The real file. Not Hammond's file, Sterling's file, handed to Hammond with coffee and golf anecdotes and the kind of casual authority that made institutions move. Sarah had seen it before, in a different uniform, in a different country. The way power protected itself. The way hierarchies buried inconvenient people. What did my references say? Sarah asked. Hammond paused. That hesitation was everything. We've had difficulty reaching most of them. Several numbers appear to be disconnected. One employer, from your nursing background before Denver, said he had no record of your employment there. Sarah had given them 3 references. All fabricated. All carefully constructed to give just enough verifiable employment history to pass a surface check, but nothing deep enough to actually call and confirm. Because her real employment history was classified. Because a senior chief petty officer's actual resume consisted of field hospitals in Tikrit, emergency medicine under fire, trauma protocols that never made it into civilian textbooks, and 3 Purple Hearts that would never appear in any hospital database. I may have made some errors on the application, Sarah said quietly. My previous moves were difficult. I didn't want anyone contacting old employers who knew my family situation. It wasn't a lie. Just a misdirection. The kind you learned in interrogation resistance training, give them something true enough to believe, vague enough to stop asking questions. Hammond's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her posture. The assumption of guilt had already calcified before she walked in. Sterling had made sure of that. We're going to need to verify your actual employment history before we can move forward with your credentialing. How long will that take? That depends on how quickly you can provide legitimate references. Hammond stood, signaling the conversation was over. In the meantime, Dr. Sterling has recommended we place you on a modified schedule. Effective tonight, you're being reassigned to pediatrics. Night shift, but a different patient population. Sarah understood the math immediately. Pediatrics wasn't punishment, it was isolation. She'd never see Marcus Webb again. She'd never know if he woke up, if something changed in those brilliant dark eyes that didn't remember carrying her through gunfire. In a hospital, being transferred away from a floor was like being transferred out of a squad. You disappeared from that person's life completely. When does it take effect? After your shift tonight. Sarah stood, movements economical. Everything about her was economical now, speech, gesture, breath. I understand. Walking back to the ICU, the hallway felt longer than it should have. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric song above her head, the kind of sound that wore on you after enough nights, 12 weeks of it, actually. 78 night shifts. She'd counted them because counting was how you survived things that didn't make sense. You imposed order on chaos. You reduced infinity to numbers you could hold in your hands. Patricia was at the nurse's station when Sarah arrived. The charge nurse looked genuinely uncomfortable, which meant Sterling had leaned on her too. Patricia was kind, fundamentally, the sort of nurse who actually cared about her patients, which made her vulnerable to administrative pressure. "I heard about the reassignment," Patricia said quietly. "I'm sorry. It's not right. It's what it is. He's pushing you out. Everyone knows it." Sarah didn't answer. Didn't need to. The facts were evident to anyone paying attention, but facts didn't matter against institutional power. Sterling had board members who golfed with him. He had a history at Sacred Heart that predated her arrival by 2 decades. He had the kind of credibility that came from staying in one place long enough to become synonymous with it. Against that, Sarah had 12 weeks and a fabricated employment history. The shift began like any other. Sarah moved through her assigned patients, 3 admissions, 1 post-op recovery, medication rounds at scheduled times. She stayed away from Marcus's room, followed every protocol with mechanical precision, the kind of perfect compliance that meant no one could find anything else to criticize. But from the nurse's station, she watched his monitors. A habit now. Something her nervous system did without permission from her conscious mind. By 1400 hours, Denver had transformed into something from a Currier and Ives painting. The snow had piled up to the hospital's lower windows, and the city beyond had gone quiet with that peculiar silence that came with genuine weather events. Traffic crawled. The emergency department was backing up, people slipping on ice, minor accidents, the kind of overflow that happened when an entire city suddenly moved more carefully. By 1600 hours, the hospital was short 3 nurses on day shift. People who'd called in because the drive had become impossible, the roads too dangerous. The overnight census had been high, 17 ICU patients instead of the usual 12, and as the day shift ended, no one had arrived yet to relieve them. There would be a gap. Maybe an hour, maybe 2, depending on how long it took people to navigate the frozen roads. Sarah was in room 403 when the first monitor alarm sounded from 407. Not a regular alert. The kind of alarm that meant the system had detected something serious. Her head came up automatically, muscle memory from 16 years of field medicine, before her conscious mind could remind her that Marcus Webb wasn't her patient anymore. She could see the monitor from the doorway of 403. Heart rate 128. Climbing. O2 saturation 89 and dropping. His chest wall looked wrong, that subtle asymmetry that meant his lung wasn't filling evenly. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, collapsing one lung, pushing on the other, compromising everything. Sarah's hand stopped moving. Not from fear. From the weight of understanding what came next. Dr. Reeves was on the 3rd floor, 15 minutes away even if he left immediately. The nearest attending was Sterling, and Sterling was standing at the nurse's station right now, reading a chart with the kind of absorbed focus that meant he wouldn't move for anything short of a code. Sarah walked to the station. Her voice came out level. Professional. Dr. Sterling, Marcus Webb's O2 is dropping rapidly. Pressure's climbing. Possible pneumothorax. Sterling looked up slowly, as if her interruption had pulled him from something of great importance. Who's his attending? Dr. Reeves. 3rd floor. Then call Reeves. That's not your patient, is it? The words hung there. Not a question. A trap. The moment she acknowledged responsibility, she'd be outside her assigned scope. The moment she acted, she'd be the nurse who couldn't follow orders, who insisted on insubordination, who couldn't respect the hierarchy that held everything together. Sarah turned and walked toward the supply room. Sterling's voice followed her like shrapnel. Jen. You're on pediatric starting at shift change. Dr. Reeves will handle ICU cases. She didn't stop. Didn't slow. Kept moving the way she'd learned to move through bullets, present but unreachable, committed to the next 3 seconds only. The supply cart with the 14-gauge needles was right where it should be. The procedure for needle decompression at the second intercostal space was muscle memory. She'd performed it in a Humvee under fire. She'd performed it in a battalion aid station where the lights kept flickering and someone kept screaming for their mother. She'd performed it on soldiers who'd carried her name into battle. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what happened the moment she pulled open the supply room door, the moment her eyes registered the 14-gauge needle in her palm, the moment Sterling's voice turned from cold to something else entirely, something that sounded like fear. In the waiting room beyond the ICU, Tommy Webb, Marcus's brother, saw the same thing on the visitor monitor that Sarah had seen. The heart rate climbing. The O2 dropping. The unmistakable indicators of a crisis that no one was responding to. He'd been sitting there for 4 hours. Sleeping in his truck the night before. Medication wearing off because the stress had thrown his whole system into chaos. By 16:30 hours, his leg was bouncing against the tile floor like a piston, and his mind was doing what traumatized minds do, creating narratives of abandonment, of failure, of death happening behind locked doors while strangers in white coats watched charts instead of people. He stood up. Walked to the ICU security doors. They were locked. Visiting hours had ended at 1600. He pressed his face against the glass. He could see the monitors from here, the same ones that showed him his brother's vital signs in real time. He could see that something was wrong. That no one was moving. That his brother was dying while he stood on the wrong side of glass. Tommy Webb was 6'3" and carried 250 pounds of guilt and rage and medication wearing off at exactly the wrong moment. He knocked on the door. Politely at first. Then less politely. Then he was hitting the door hard enough that security noticed, and security was walking toward him with that particular calm that meant they'd been trained in de-escalation, which meant they didn't understand that some things couldn't be de-escalated, some fears couldn't be managed, some moments couldn't be talked down. "My brother's monitors," Tommy said. His voice had the texture of gravel and panic. "Something's wrong. I can see it. You need to help him." Visiting hours ended. The security guard said gently, "We can call up to the ICU. I don't need you to call. I need you to open the door." The moment was only 3 seconds long, but it felt longer. Long enough to see the calculations happening behind the security guard's eyes. Long enough to understand that the door would not open, that there were protocols, that there was a system in place that would proceed at its own pace regardless of whether a man was dying on the other side of reinforced glass. Tommy walked backward 3 steps. Then he turned and ran directly through the waiting room, sending a chair flying, scattering the handful of visitors like startled birds, and crashed through the ICU access doors with his shoulder because sometimes the only way through a wall is straight through it. Security fumbled for radios. Visitors scrambled toward exits. The waiting room erupted into the particular chaos that comes when violence enters somewhere it wasn't invited, and in that chaos, from 50 feet away and behind 2 sets of doors, Sarah Chen heard something that rewired every system in her body, not an alarm, not a voice, but the absence of them. The moment when a monitor goes quiet. When a heart stops its electrical argument with gravity. When the body gives up waiting for help that isn't coming. She pulled the 14-gauge needle into her pocket. Moved toward the ICU floor like she'd moved through Tikrit, present, calm, lethal in her certainty. The waiting room was imploding in real time. Tommy Webb was being backed away by 3 security guards who looked terrified, and Dr. Sterling was standing directly in Sarah's path, watching her with an expression that had finally shifted from arrogance to something closer to understanding. He understood, in that moment, that she was about to break every rule he'd written. That she was about to step so far outside protocol that it would provide the perfect justification for his termination file. And he understood, looking at her face, that she'd already made the calculation and decided the cost was worth it. The snow outside continued to fall silently, covering Denver in white, burying the city deeper into isolation, and in room 407, Marcus Webb's lungs stopped their desperate work. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hum as Marcus Webb's monitor screamed. One steady beat became two, became a frantic chorus, the rhythm of collapse accelerating across the screen. His oxygen saturation plummeted like a stone through dark water, 94, 88, 72. The trachea on his chest X-ray was already deviated, the signature of tension pneumothorax, a lung collapsing inward, crushing the heart with every breath that didn't come. Sarah was 20 feet away when Tommy Webb burst through the ICU waiting room doors like a freight train wrapped in skin and grief. He was 250 pounds of former linebacker converted into rage by hospital policies and benzodiazepines and the specific kind of madness that comes from watching your brother die slowly while doctors talk around the problem. His voice didn't just fill the waiting room, it consumed it, a roar that made the walls seem smaller. You're killing him. You're letting him die. His fists clenched and unclenched, looking for something solid to hit. A chair went over backward with a plastic crack. Magazines scattered across linoleum like snow. Security guards pressed themselves against the walls, radios crackling with codes nobody understood. Visitors scattered backward toward the elevators, moving like water flowing around a stone. Nobody moved toward Tommy Webb. Nobody moved toward the crisis at all. Dr. Sterling's voice came sharp from somewhere behind a pillar. Chen, stay back. Let security handle this. He said it the way a man says words when he's already calculating how to use the chaos for his own ends, how to document her insubordination, how to add this to the file he was building, brick by brick, to bury her alive professionally. Sarah didn't break stride. She moved past the panicked staff with the kind of calm that comes from having already survived worse things than a grief-stricken man in a hospital waiting room. Her eyes were locked on Tommy, but her attention was split three ways, tracking his body position, reading his breathing, and watching the monitor display over his shoulder. O2 sat 68 now. 65. The blue lips starting to deepen to purple. Tommy. Her voice cut through his rage like a blade through silk. Not loud. Not commanding. Just absolute. He spun toward her, fists still clenched, face contorted into something that looked almost inhuman. The machines around Marcus screamed louder. They're killing him. They won't do anything, they just stand there while he dies. Sarah moved closer, her movements precise and economical. I know. His lung is collapsing. Tension pneumothorax. She let him see her hands, open and visible. I can fix it. But I need you to move. Now. Something in her tone penetrated the chemical and emotional fog that had wrapped around his brain. It was the sound of absolute certainty. The sound of someone who had walked through worse and emerged intact. His fists unclenched, just barely. You can help him. Move. Now. He stepped aside. The space he opened was just wide enough. Sarah was already moving, already calculating, already 3 steps ahead of the panic still unfolding around her. She grabbed a 14-gauge angiocath needle from the mobile crash cart. Sterling had locked the main supply room with his usual bureaucratic pettiness, but he'd forgotten about the portable unit stationed at the nurse's station. The needle was preloaded, sterile, exactly what she needed. Her hands didn't shake. They never did. Room for 07 was 3 strides away. Tommy and 2 security guards followed her, moving like satellites caught in her orbit. Marcus lay on the bed with lips the color of bruised plums, his trachea visibly deviated, his breathing coming in short desperate gasps that rattled like wind through a broken house. The monitor screamed, 62% oxygen saturation. The alarm had been muted by someone trying to create the illusion of calm, but the numbers told the truth. He was dying. Sarah counted ribs. 1, 2, there. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Anatomy laid out like a map she'd studied 1,000 times before, not in textbooks but intense and on bare ground under the kind of pressure that turned knowledge into reflex. She prepped the site with antiseptic, 1 swipe, and the alcohol smell cut through everything else, and positioned the needle with a kind of precision that made the procedure look effortless. Medical precision is 90% knowing where to go and 10% actually going there. She knew. The needle went in. The hiss of released pressure came like a sigh of relief from the universe itself. 15 seconds. That was all it took. The trachea shifted back into alignment. Marcus's chest rose properly for the first time in 5 minutes. The monitor's oxygen saturation began to climb, 68, 74, 81, climbing toward 90. Sinus rhythm re-established itself with the confidence of a conductor reclaiming an orchestra. The color in his lips began its slow shift back toward something that resembled living flesh. Tommy Webb collapsed into the chair behind him, sobbing with the kind of intensity that only comes when you think you've lost someone and then, 3 seconds later, realize you might not. Sarah stepped back. Adrenaline was still flooding her system, but she'd learned long ago how to let it exist without letting it show. She turned and found Dr. Sterling in the doorway with 2 security guards flanking him like apostles, and beside him stood Patricia Hammond with her phone still recording, her eyes wide and locked on Sarah's face. His expression was pure triumph. Sterling had his narrative now. Sterling had his exit strategy. That was an unauthorized procedure. His voice came out smooth as expensive scotch, already practiced in its righteousness. You're not credentialed for invasive interventions. You endangered this patient with reckless action and violated hospital protocol in front of witnesses. Patricia's voice came out small and trembling. Sterling, she saved his. She violated protocol. Sterling didn't even glance at her. He was looking at Hammond, who stood with phone out. Judith, you witnessed this contamination of procedure. Hammond appeared from the hallway behind them, moving like she'd been waiting for her cue. Her phone was already out, already recording. I did, she said. Her voice was flat, rehearsed. The words of someone reading from a script Sterling had provided 3 days earlier, probably. Sarah had seen this kind of thing before, not in hospitals, but in military settings, where power coordinated with power and ordinary people became invisible. Sterling turned to the security guards with the casual authority of a man who'd never met a consequence he couldn't outsource. Escort Miss Chen out. Surrender your badge. You're terminated for patient endangerment and insubordination. Effective immediately. Sarah's face showed nothing. Not the rage that should have been there. Not the frustration that might have been justified. Nothing. She took one measured breath, let the adrenaline settle into her chest where it couldn't show, and reached for her badge. The plastic was still warm from her body heat. She handed it over to the nearest security guard, who took it with the confused expression of someone who'd expected more resistance, more emotion, more evidence of the breaking of a human being. Marcus Webb's brother was correct, Sarah said. Her voice had dropped an octave from where it usually sat, and something in that shift made everyone within 10 feet go absolutely still. Someone was killing him. Just not with incompetence. She looked directly at Sterling, and he had to fight the instinct to step backward. But you already knew that. She walked out past a dozen staff members who suddenly became very interested in their shoes, their clipboards, the fascinating patterns of the ceiling tiles. None of them met her eyes. Sterling's network of allies, Hammond with her phone, the 2 security guards, the administrators hovering at the edge of the group, nodded in that rehearsed agreement that only happened when power had already decided the narrative before the facts arrived. Patricia opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again, but Sarah was already past her, moving toward the locker room where 3 months of her life was compressed into a single cardboard box. The locker room was empty. It always was on the night shift, that was one of the reasons she'd chosen it. She packed with the same precision she'd used on the needle, the cracked mug that read World's Okayest nursed in fading print, a dying succulent with leaves like brown paper, a photograph of Staff Sergeant Maria Ramos from her squad, taken in Tikrit in 2018, before the IED. Before everything changed. She left the combat boots sitting on the locker shelf, worn leather cracked in the places where her feet had learned to take weight that never should have fallen on any person. Some things were harder to carry when you were supposed to be invisible. Outside, December rain had started, the kind that fell in Denver like an afterthought, cold and determined and utterly indifferent to human suffering. It was past midnight. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered like dice thrown by drunk hands. Sarah stood at the bus stop with the cardboard box clutched against her chest, watching her breath fog in the cold air, watching headlights blur into halos through the rain and the exhaustion and the weight of being alive when everyone around you thought you should be destroyed. The next bus wasn't coming for 37 minutes. She knew this because she'd already looked it up, already calculated whether she could afford the motel on 4th Street or if she needed to find the shelter. Already figured out which of her meager savings would need to stretch until she figured out who she was supposed to be without the job that had given her purpose when her country decided she was too damaged to keep. She was still standing there when the sky started to lighten at the edges, when the rain stopped and the city began to move. She was still standing there when the first Humvee turned into the hospital parking lot. She was still standing there when 2 more followed, blocking the ambulance bay with the casual authority of the genuinely important. She was still standing there when the Brigadier General in dress uniform stepped out of the lead vehicle, boots hitting pavement with the kind of sound that made authority visible. But that wasn't the worst part. That wasn't the part that would change everything. Dr. Sterling's face went pale as the General stepped forward, but he moved faster, turning to the hospital president with both hands raised, voice sharp and controlled. "Mr. Michaels, I have documented evidence of protocol violations." This woman performed a procedure outside her scope of practice. She endangered. The president's expression didn't change. He simply looked at Sterling for 3 seconds, the kind of silence that fills a room like water, and then he spoke in a voice that carried the weight of 30 years in healthcare administration. "You're terminated. Effective immediately." The words hung in the air like a gavel striking wood. Sterling's mouth opened. No sound came out. Around him, the room shifted. Dr. Reeves took a half step away, suddenly very interested in his own shoes. Patricia, the charge nurse who'd been nodding along with Sterling's complaints for 3 months, suddenly found her phone fascinating. The residents who'd laughed in the cafeteria when Sterling knocked Sarah's tray to the floor turned their backs with the fluid coordination of schooling fish. Hammond, the outside investigator Sterling had been cultivating for weeks, quietly closed her folder and started moving toward the exit. Agent Carlson, the federal investigator who'd arrived with the general, stepped directly into her path. "Mrs. Hammond, we'll need your cooperation regarding falsified reports submitted to the state licensing board." Hammond's face went the color of hospital walls. Sterling found his voice again, but it had changed. The measured, commanding tone was gone. What remained was desperate. "This is absurd. I followed protocol." She performed an unauthorized needle decompression without physician authorization. That's Morrison, a senior attending who'd watched Sterling bully residents for years, cut him off with the precision of a scalpel. "You blocked a combat medic from saving a dying patient. Then you fired her for doing it anyway." Sterling turned back to Michaels, voice rising now, the careful composure cracking like old paint. "Michael, we've known each other for 23 years. We played golf together. We've served on the accreditation committee." The president's voice was quieter than before, which somehow made it more final. "Get him out of my hospital." Security approached from the left side of the room. Sterling backed away from them, hand still up, voice climbing higher. "You don't understand." She was hiding her background. There were gaps in her employment history. She never disclosed prior military service. Agent Carlson stepped forward, speaking with the kind of authority that came from federal jurisdiction and the backing of people in much larger buildings than this one. She was on authorized personal leave, recovering from service-related PTSD. That leave remains valid. You had no authority to terminate her employment. What you did commit was federal fraud, billing for procedures that never occurred, kickback arrangements with imaging facilities, falsified patient records. Do you see the difference, Doctor? The news cameras caught everything. The cameras that had been allowed into the ICU for the story about the violent incident caught Sterling's voice rising to a shout, caught him being escorted out by 2 security officers while he protested, caught the moment his certainty collapsed in real time. The room watched in silence after he was gone. The kind of silence that comes when a room full of people has just watched the structure of power they thought was permanent crumble like old drywall. General Hutchins approached Sarah, who had stood motionless through the entire sequence, one tear tracking down her face, the only sign that anything had reached her at all. She hadn't wiped it away. She wouldn't, not yet. The general's posture was perfect, the kind of straight-back bearing that comes from 40 years of service. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, respectful, the tone you use when addressing someone who's seen things you hope you never have to see. Senior Chief Chen. The Navy granted you indefinite personal leave 6 months ago. That leave remains in full effect. You're under military jurisdiction, which means Sterling had no authority to terminate you in the first place. He was operating outside any legal framework. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper, but it was steady, the way her voice always was. With respect, sir, I walked away. I made that choice. I don't. The general raised one hand, not in a commanding gesture, but gently. You walked away with honor. You're still one of ours. When you're ready to come back, if you want to come back, we're ready to have you. But that choice is yours. That's always been yours. He stepped back, allowing her space, and somehow that small gesture of respect meant more than anything else that had happened in the room. In room 407, 60 feet away, Marcus's monitors began showing increased activity. Not the ragged, struggling rhythm they'd shown for 3 months. Something else. Something that looked like waking. Dr. Patel, the neurologist, checked the charts with the kind of attention that usually meant good news or very bad news. She looked up from the monitors and spoke directly to the nursing staff. The needle decompression didn't just decompress the pneumothorax. It restored oxygen flow at a critical moment. There's evidence of decreased intracranial pressure. He's showing signs of emerging consciousness. Tommy Webb stood at his brother's bedside with little Emma, who was holding a stuffed rabbit and looking at the monitors with the serious expression of a child who didn't fully understand what was happening but knew it was important. Tommy looked through the window at Sarah, watched her standing with the general, and mouthed 2 words clearly enough that she could read his lips, "Thank you." But none of that was visible on the news footage. What the cameras caught was Sarah Chen in scrubs, standing beside a United States Army general, surrounded by federal agents, while security removed Dr. Marcus Sterling from the building. What people saw when they played it back at 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock was a quiet nurse who'd saved a dying patient being vindicated, and the doctor who'd tried to destroy her career being escorted out. They didn't know her real rank. They didn't know about Tikrit. They didn't know that the person standing in that ICU had been trained in combat medicine by people whose names were classified, had carried wounded soldiers through gunfire, had been awarded medals for valor that most civilians would never understand. But someone would figure it out. Someone would, and everything would change. By midnight, Sarah stood at a bus stop 3 blocks from Sacred Heart, clutching a cardboard box against her chest. The box was soft from handling, the flaps bent at the corners. Inside were the things that were left of her civilian life. A cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in faded blue letters. A succulent, nearly dead, its leaves translucent and papery from weeks of neglect. A photograph in a cracked plastic frame, her squad leader, Sergeant Marcus Webb Sr., taken in Fallujah in 2007, 2 weeks before the IED took him. The rain came sideways, the kind of December rain that Denver gets sometimes, cold enough that the drops felt like small accusations. Sarah didn't move to shield the box. She just stood there, letting it soak, watching the cardboard darken with moisture. A bus passed without stopping, not her bus. 2 more came and went. The rain hammered the plexiglass shelter, and Sarah stood with her cardboard box and wondered if she'd ever stop running. That was the pattern, wasn't it? Tikrit, then Germany, then California where she'd told her family a story that wasn't quite true, then Denver where she'd tried to be someone normal, just a nurse, just a night shift worker helping people heal. And every time, something caught up with her. Every time, the life she'd built turned fragile as that succulent, ready to wilt if anyone asked the wrong questions. Sterling was gone now. She'd watched him being removed from the building, watched the cameras, watched Michaels make the calculation in real time, protect a doctor, or protect the hospital from a federal investigation. The hospital had its priorities. Sarah had learned long ago not to expect gratitude from institutions. Institutions protected themselves. They always did. She shifted the box against her ribs, feeling the rough cardboard against her scrubs. The rain pooled around her boots, the same combat boots she'd left in her hospital locker, waterproof and worn and carrying dirt from places the civilized world tried not to think about. No one here knew she wore them. No one at Sacred Heart knew that under the night shift scrubs and the gentle bedside manner, there were calluses on her hands from more than just 4 lines. They didn't know because she'd learned in Tikrit that truth doesn't matter when power has already written its narrative. Sterling had power, or he thought he did. He had allies, networks, the comfortable assurance of a man who'd never been told no by anyone who mattered. So she'd let him have his version of the story. She'd walked out without explaining. She'd let him think he'd won. That was her training showing. In combat medicine, you don't argue with people who have guns. You just work around them. You do your job and you survive. Sarah had kept the box because it was easier than leaving everything behind, but she'd expected to drop it at a shelter or a donation center. She hadn't expected the general. She hadn't expected federal agents. She hadn't expected any of this, which meant she should have expected all of it. Sterling was competent enough to destroy someone's life. He wasn't competent enough to understand that destroying someone's life before their military record caught up with them was like poking a hornet's nest while standing in it. The bus came, finally, the right one, and Sarah got on. The driver didn't comment on the wet box. He never did. No one looked at her. That was the thing about night buses in Denver in December. Everyone was trying not to exist, just trying to get from one place to another with minimal friction. Sarah sat near the back and held the box and watched the rain streak the windows. Somewhere in this city, Dr. Sterling was probably calling people. Making calls to allies, to board members he'd golfed with, to people who owed him favors. Building the case he'd started weeks ago, the inconsistencies in her employment history, the gaps in her background, the suspicious references. He'd been calling people since Sarah first caught him billing phantom procedures. She'd watched him do it from the corner of the nurse's station, watched him use the hospital phone and then his cell phone, watched him smile at people in the hallway with the confidence of someone who believed networks matter more than truth. Maybe they did. Maybe Sterling would find a hospital in another state that didn't care about his methods. Maybe he'd land on his feet somewhere else and do the same thing to someone else. That happened. That had always happened, in Sarah's experience. People with power protected other people with power. That was how systems worked. But right now, on this bus, with rain hammering Denver in the darkness, none of it mattered. Sarah had walked away clean. No one knew who she was. No one had seen the person underneath the scrubs. The general knew, but the general had his own reasons for letting her go. The Navy knew, they'd always known, but the Navy was somewhere else, operating according to rules that had nothing to do with Sacred Heart Hospital. Sarah was anonymous again. Just another woman on a bus with a soggy cardboard box, going nowhere in particular. She could disappear from Denver tomorrow and no one would care. She could start over somewhere else, in another hospital, another city, another version of a life that didn't quite fit. The bus rumbled through the rain toward the address on her lease. The box was falling apart now, the bottom starting to separate from the sides. Sarah didn't bother to reinforce it. She'd buy another box if she needed to. Or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe she'd scatter these things, the mug and the succulent and the photograph, and start with nothing again, the way she'd done in California, the way she'd done in Denver. The bus pulled away from downtown, and Sarah Chen looked out at the rain-soaked city and asked herself the same question she'd been asking since Tikrit: when does running stop being survival and start being just running? And as the December rain drummed against the windows and the city lights smeared past like a watercolor painting, she had no answer except the one she'd always had: tomorrow, maybe. Or the day after that. Or never? Just not today. We appreciate every one of you watching. Please hit like if you're enjoying this, subscribe if you want more stories like it, and leave a comment telling us where you're tuning in from.